Good evening. My name is Mark Crouch, and I'm the coordinator for Indiana University Labor Studies for the northeast corner of the state. And I'm pleased to be here this evening to welcome all of you to Indiana Purdue at Fort Wayne for our special evening with Noam Chomsky. We're here tonight because we are trying to raise some funds for a very worthy cause, and you're going to hear more about that a little bit later. But I wanted to, first of all, let you all know what the schedule is for this evening. Professor Chomsky will be speaking directly for about an hour, and then we're going to go into a question and answer period of time. And we'll have a couple of folks who will be handling the microphones so folks can ask questions from the floor. And then when we're done with the question and answer period, for those of you who are of the mind to do so, we have a reception that'll be held at the Carpenters Local 262 Hall, which is a little ways down the road here. We've got maps for anybody who wants to come. And that too is part of our fundraising activities for the Workers Project. So you're all welcome to come there if you can afford the small price of a $25 ticket. We are pleased tonight, or at least I'm very pleased and proud to have the opportunity to introduce to you the President of the Northeast Indiana Central Labor Council, the AFL-CIO. And he is here to introduce Professor Chomsky and get us started on our activities for the evening. I've had the pleasure of knowing Tom Lewandowski since my very first trip to Fort Wayne in the spring of 1980. And he was in the crew of people who interviewed me for this job. In fact, then once I came to work here full-time in August of 1980, he was the first person who just happened to drop by my office one day to sit down and talk about labor education and building organized labor in the Fort Wayne area. And it's been a very fruitful friendship and relationship since those early days of my time here in Fort Wayne. So it looks like we have a pretty close to a full house. We're glad you're all with us here. We also have a crew from C-SPAN that's with us tonight, and also a crew from Channel 10, and a independent fellow too that's recording things for those who are interested in the work of Professor Chomsky. So at this time I want to bring forward Tom Lewandowski of the Northeast Indiana Central Labor Council, AFL-CIO.
Thanks, Mark. I wasn't expected to be introduced in such flowery terms, but thank you anyway. This is kind of a strange turn of events. We've had a lot of people who bought tickets and say, how is it that you got Noam Chomsky to come to Fort Wayne? And there's a little bit of a story here, and it goes back to, I think, what we're all about in this room, every one of us. Let me explain. The Central Labor Council is the AFL-CIO from Northeast Indiana. There are 91 unions who voluntarily joined the Central Labor Council. Our mission statement is to organize in the community to promote social justice for all working people. It's a broad mission, one that we consider a license to raise hell. As part of our mission, We realize there are limits to what a Central Labor Council can do, because traditionally Central Labor Councils represent those people who are members, who are part of organized labor. It became clear that the labor movement needed to grow in different ways. And a number of us, the executive board from the Central Labor Council, a lot of activists from the Central Labor Council, people from the community, have all come together to create an organization we call the Workers' Project Incorporated. Our goal is to find ways to represent the unrepresented workers, to recreate the social contract that has been destroyed in recent years. Among those projects that we have for the Workers' Project is one initiative we call the High School Workers Initiative. This is a pilot program in which we train high school students in terms of, we teach them about employment rights. They take classes from Mark. They take a lot of education from a lot of different people about how to represent and care for people. We're putting these high school students, try to make our eventual goals to have at least one high school student in every high school to represent high school workers who are being exploited on the job. And it's happening at an all too frequent rate. Our high school stewards, two of whom are in the back of the room here, have uncovered all kinds of things. Well, the variety of things that have happened to high school workers is, well, as all of you know who work, you know that all kinds of bad things happen. There's been sexual exploitation, wages that aren't being paid. But we have to find a way for these high school workers to represent themselves, to recreate the social contract. This Workers' Project and the High School Workers Initiative is something we think is pretty bold, what we call labor market organizing. And about, 10 months ago or so, we said, who is a leading advocate for democracy and human rights and would care about these issues? And it was Noam Chomsky. So we sent a letter. Hey, it's worth a try. It's more than worth a try, because Noam said yes. And he has come to support our efforts with the Workers' Project, and we consider that a great honor. It is a great honor because, simply said, Noam Chomsky is an intellectual who is the most ardent advocate of democracy and human rights in America, possibly the world, and we're honored to have him speak to us. Noam?
Thanks. I have to say that invitation didn't take a lot of convincing. I'm really delighted to have an opportunity to have at least a brief contact with a project this important and impressive. I want to say some things about the way the world is, the way we're taught the world is, and then about the way most people experience the world here, and even more so in countries that aren't as rich and full of advantages as this one, and then talk about why, how come things turn out like this, and towards the end, what are some of the plans that are now being laid, mostly in secrecy, to enhance a process which is quite injurious to the large majority of the people of the United States, and even more so elsewhere, which is why they're kept secret. Well, how is the world presented to us? We don't have to spend much time on this because you hear it all day and every day. I'll just take one example from the New York Times newspaper of record, a lead story in the Sunday Times last week. Headline is, by one of their leading correspondents. The headline reads, "America is prosperous and smug." Americans, goes on to say, Americans have boundless confidence, expectations of unlimited economic success. They're living in the happy glow of an American boom, a fairy tale U.S. expansion since 1991, under the direction of the man who the international financial press christens the saintly Alan Greenspan, with due reverence. Well, that's the way things are supposed to be. Okay, you can ask yourself whether they are. Let's have a look at the way they are, beginning with the happy glow of the American boom and the fairy tale expansion. Well, it certainly has been a fairy tale for some sectors of the population, namely the business world. In fact, the story that I just quoted actually gives one example of the fairy tale economy, namely the stock market. And it's true that asset inflation is going through the roof and concerning plenty of economists. And that's a real benefit to the 1% of the population who own, of households who own half the stock, roughly comparable figures for other assets, or even the top 10% who own about 90% of them. If you throw in pension funds, you get a little redistribution of figures among the top fifth. For the rest of the population, it's essentially irrelevant. It's also pretty much irrelevant for the economy. That's another story. But for them, it's certainly been a fairy tale, especially the top 1%. In fact, it's been a fairy tale for the business world altogether. So year after year, you have reports of what they call dazzling, stupendous profit growth, breaking all records. The problems, if you read Business Week, you find out that the problems that the business world faces are things like what to do with all that cash as surging profits are overflowing the coffers of corporate America, with liquid assets of non-financial institutions, corporations, reaching a staggering $2/3 of $1 trillion, which is causing vexing problems for Boeing and Intel and General Electric and other suffering corporations. Undoubtedly, it's a fairy tale. Looking at the rest of us, since 1991 is in fact the post-war period. It's even below the quite anemic of the 1980s and the 90s, and well below the historical average since the Civil War. In fact, the worst one on record. That's the fairy tale growth rate. If you look at per capita economic growth, and you rank the United States among the OECD countries, the 29 rich countries, it's about average, actually slightly below average in per capita economic growth in the 90s. Picked up a little the last couple of quarters, but in general, not only unusually slow growth, but unusually slow growth of productivity, which is a predictor for the future. That's the fairy tale economy. So how come it does raise a question? How could we have stupendous profit growth when the fairy tale expansion is the weakest since World War II? Well, there's actually a pretty simple answer to that. For approximately 2/3 of the population, hourly wages have either stagnated or declined in the last 20 years. Working hours are going up, wages are going down. The average wage is probably 15% lower than it was in the mid-'70s. Entry-level wages, first job, they collapsed during the 1980s. They went down by about 30%. You read, and economists tell you, well, this is only unskilled workers, but then small footnote, the definition of unskilled workers is about 75% of the workforce. In the late 1980s, which was a period of weak recovery, better than this one, but still some kind of recovery, during the latter half of the 1980s, hunger in the United States went up by 50%, reached 30 million people. You go back to around 1980, the United States was more or less average like other industrial countries by measures like, say, child poverty or malnutrition, infant mortality, percentage of the population in prison, inequality, other standard quality of life measures. By the end of the 1980s, it was far in the lead, and it's going still farther in the lead by such measures, if lead is the right word. During the 1980s, industrial accidents on the job doubled. Illegal firing of union organizers tripled in the 1980s, along with a whole host of other violations of labor laws. The Reagan administration, in effect, informed the business world that it simply wasn't going to enforce the laws. They could be on the books if you want, but they weren't going to enforce them. An advantage was taken of that. Again, you can read about it in Business Week, which described it quite accurately. That's continuing under Clinton. That's a big factor in the rising inequality, in the attack on wages, on incomes, and in fact, it's kind of recognized in the business pages of the New York Times, not the lead stories of the kind I read, where they describe what they call a treadmill economy, in which most people are going nowhere fast, with quite poor prospects because of such factors as unusually low productivity growth, low entry-level wages, and so on. Well, what about the boundless confidence of the smug, prosperous Americans? You can learn about that from the New York Times, too. There's another front-page story with the title, Rehabilitation of Mourning in America. Mourning in America was the slogan that Reagan speechwriters gave him when he's riding off into the sunset and imitating John Wayne or something. So now there's a rehabilitation of mourning in America. And the story goes on to explain that things are really looking up, contrary to the doomsayers with all their boring statistics about hungry children and wage decline and all that kind of nonsense. The story does concede that, I'm quoting it now, things are looking up mostly for the well-off and successful. People like Jerry Jasinowski, who's the head of the National Association of Manufacturers, who's quoted liberally right through the story. In fact, the main person quoted. But then the story says, it's not just the well-off and successful. Even the millions who, I'm quoting, even the millions who are suffering appear to be helping reestablish what Mr. Jasinowski considers the right priorities as their expectations have diminished. So they're pretty well off too. Of course, the right priorities for the business world are a little different. I mean, there they are surging profits, overflowing the coffers of corporate America and causing vexing problems and so on. The story quotes the head of the University of Michigan Research Center, which is the main center that kind of monitors public opinion regularly. He says, it's like people are saying, I'm not earning enough to get by, but it's not as bad as it could be. While before the Reagan-Clinton economic miracle, people had old-fashioned ideas about getting by. So it's mourning in America. Americans are prosperous and smug with boundless confidence and so on. What is all this about? Well, it actually makes perfect sense if you understand how to read English. You have to understand that the word Americans doesn't refer to Americans. Americans refers to the constituency of the New York Times, the people who they meet in elegant restaurants and executive suites and editorial offices and so on. That's Americans, and they're prosperous and smug, and they have boundless expectations, and for them it's a fairy tale economy. And if there's other sort of two-legged creatures out there, they have to establish the right priorities, which are, well, could be worse, and maybe I'm not getting by, but don't have any expectations, even as things get worse and worse. That's what's called a healthy economy, a fairy tale economy, and from a certain point of view, it is. Let's take a look at the saintly Alan Greenspan, who presided over the fairy tale economy in the 1990s. He testified about it to the Senate Banking Committee about a year ago. He was very proud of his achievement, and he explained it. He attributed the miracle to what he called greater worker insecurity, meaning workers are intimidated. They're afraid to ask for a living wage or for benefits, and that's a good thing. That contributes to what's called the health of the economy. That's it. Health of the economy is a term kind of like Americans. It doesn't mean what the words seem to indicate. It's a technical term which refers to making sure the Americans are smug and prosperous, whatever happens to the population. Health of the economy is a term that's uncorrelated with the health of the economy, even the literal health of the population. So these are good things. That's what we should hope for. So naturally, we're proud. Workers are nice and intimidated, and so on. The economic report of the president, which comes out every year, described pretty much the same things in sort of more muted terms. They also took pride. The Clinton administration took pride in the fairy tale boom, and they attributed it to significant wage restraint, which they say results from changes in labor market institutions and practices, which are not detailed, but they include things like, for example, not enforcing the laws about illegal strike breaking, or not enforcing OSHA regulations, safety and health regulations, which accounts for the sharp rise in industrial accidents and so on. So that's change in labor market institutions and practices. There are other changes. The United States, one of the major ones is the use of what are called permanent replacement workers, which is a step worse than strike breakers. That's impermissible in any industrial country. In fact, the United States has been censured by the International Labor Organization for resorting to this practice. You should realize that the ILO very rarely criticizes its main funders. So this was quite unusual. When the U.S. was censured, I think it was 1992, there were two industrial countries that allowed permanent replacement workers, the United States and South Africa. I think South Africa is now off the boat with the unfortunate changes that have taken place there in the last couple of years. So that means the United States is probably alone in this respect, which wouldn't be too surprising. The United States also has the worst record in Europe and the Western Hemisphere in ratifying ILO labor conventions on labor rights. If you're really a stickler, you ought to catch me on that. It actually has the third worst record. Lithuania and El Salvador are worse, but we're third last time that the ILO came out with a list of conventions. So it's not too surprising that we don't adhere to to the international conventions on strike breaking. That's another change in labor market institutions and practices. There are others. Take a look at the Caterpillar strike that just ended with a big defeat for working people. Caterpillar did resort to the permanent replacement workers option, but also to other things. Caterpillar, like other major corporations, other Americans, in the special sense of the press, Caterpillar enjoyed dazzling profits. It was part of the huge profit boom, and it used the profits not for economic growth, but for excess production, for creation of excess capacity abroad. That doesn't contribute to economic health in the ordinary sense, but it does contribute to class warfare, and it makes good sense for that reason. If you have excess capacity abroad, then if working people in Illinois strike, you can fill fill the orders for your markets by using super exploited cheap labor abroad that you've got available thanks to the excess capacity that you've created a result of the dazzling profits. So that's a good way of attacking American workers. And that, again, contributes to the health of the economy and the fairy tale boom and so on. The general fact is that capital is extremely mobile now. It wasn't always. I'll come back to why it is so mobile. But labor obviously isn't. Furthermore, the links among working people are extremely weak. There have been major attacks on the unions even within countries, but the international links are weak, and to confront coordinated, concentrated, tyrannical structures with enormous resources is very difficult, particularly when they're backed by powerful states and by huge secret bureaucracies like the IMF, which are devoted to their interests and so on. It's an unequal struggle, unless it is equalized and changed, the future, at least for democracy and human rights, doesn't look so great. Another change in labor market institutions and practices results from the trade agreements, the mislabeled free trade agreements. So take, say, NAFTA. NAFTA is an investor rights agreement. It's not a free trade agreement. It has some wording about labor rights and environmental rights, but they're basically toothless. They were put in to get people to shut up. But they're not completely vacuous. Under NAFTA rules, it's possible for workers to bring complaints about illegal labor practices, and in fact, some did so. Telecommunication workers brought a complaint under NAFTA. They actually won, but the corporation got a tap on the wrist a couple of years later. It didn't amount to anything. But one side effect of it was that there was a study done under NAFTA rules about the role of NAFTA in strike breaking in the United States. It was done by a labor historian at Cornell University, Kate Bronfenbrenner, published under NAFTA, suppressed by the Clinton administration, but released by Canada and Mexico. Her conclusion is that I think the Clinton administration finally released it after a delay, not that you'd know anything about it by reading the press. According to her study, about half of organizing efforts since NAFTA have been disrupted by threats to transfer. That means things like putting a trailer outside a plant where people are trying to organize with a sign that says, Mexican transfer job or something like that. And these threats are not idle. When organizing efforts nevertheless succeed, there have been closures at triple the pre-NAFTA rate. So they're meaningful threats. Of course, it's all illegal. All such efforts at strike breaking are illegal, but remember, that's a technicality since the Reagan administration and now the Clinton administration have essentially informed the business world that you don't have to worry about laws because we're not going to enforce them. Crime pays, in other words, with state protection. Well, that's a sample of some of the benign changes in labor market institutions and practices that leads to significant wage restraint and gives us a fairy tale economy for Americans who are smug and prosperous. All you have to do is translate the words a little, and you go from propaganda to reality quite easily. The saintly Allen also gives public talks. He gave one recently to the newspaper editors meeting in the United States. Interesting talk, worth reading. It's full of passionate rhetoric about the miracles of the market, the wonders that are brought about by consumer choice and all these magnificent things. And he even gave examples, which is nice. His examples are the internet, computers, information processing, satellites, and transistors, a couple of others. Now, those are kind of interesting examples of the miracles of the market and consumer choice, because as even the most ignorant economist knows, those are textbook examples of creativity and production in the state sector, in the public sector, picked up later by the business world, given to them as gifts after the work's been done. So take, say, the internet, which, the stellar example. That was developed for 30 years within the Pentagon, and then the National Science Foundation. And just a year or two ago was handed over to private corporations. So now, Bill Gates is real interested in the internet. For the 30 years that it was being developed, private business had no interest. Gates wouldn't even go to a conference on the internet 2 or 3 years ago. I have to say, he is honest about it. He has attributed his success to his ability to, I'm quoting him, to embrace and expand the ideas of others, most of which come from your pocketbook, incidentally. The internet is almost a classic example. Take computers, kind of the core of a modern industrial society. Same story. In the 1950s, they were unmarketable, so the public paid for the research and development under the cover of an air defense system and other such things. When they advanced to the point where you could sell them, they were handed over to private corporations, some of them spin-offs from the military project. That's why IBM isn't making typewriters anymore, and so on for a whole bunch of others. But the public contribution remained, and in the 1980s particularly, it went up with new developments in advanced computer technology and so on. That's computers. It's the same story with information processing, satellites, too obvious to comment. The one example that he mentioned that where you could claim that there's a private sector contribution in the crucial research and development stage is transistors. So that one's worth looking at. The others aren't even a joke. This one is at least a joke, which is what it is. Transistors were, in fact, invented in a private laboratory, Bell Labs, in 1947. But what was the role of the market and consumer choice in that? Well, the answer is zero, because Bell Labs was the laboratory of AT&T, which was a government-supported monopoly. So there's no consumer choice and no market. Since it was a monopoly, it was able to charge monopoly prices, which is in effect a tax on the public. And taxing the public, through taxing the public, it was able to establish a very good laboratory. Bell Labs was a fine lab where they invented transistors and solar cells and information theory and radio astronomy, all kinds of work. It was a great lab. I used to go there in the 50s. As soon as the monopoly was broken, Bell Labs went down the tube because the public wasn't paying for it anymore. So no more Bell Labs. But it's true that in 1947, a government-supported monopoly was able to use indirect taxation to develop transistors. However, that's not the end of the story. The development of transistors was based on wartime technology developed during the war, again, at public expense. Furthermore, when transistors were developed, there was nothing much to do with them. So the government stepped in, meaning you stepped in, or your parents, or whatever, and paid for transistor research and development. The government procurement was the total use of transistors in the early crucial years when the research and designs and production techniques and so on were developed. In fact, 10 years after they were invented, the Western Electric Company, which is Bell's AT&T supplier, they were producing, I think, a couple 100,000 transistors, and 100% of them were for the government market. So that's the one example which maybe rises to the level of a joke of the miracles of the market and consumer choice. These are the Saintly Allen's examples. I didn't pick them. But in fact, again, as even the most ignorant economist must know, certainly the business world knows, just about every dynamic sector of the U.S. economy works that way, whether it's electronics or pharmaceuticals or biotechnology or whatever. There's an enormous public component for the research and development stage and for absorption of risk. The story is that the way the miracles of the market are supposed to work, the cost and risk are socialized. They're the public's responsibility. There is a private component, namely profit and power are privatized. That's really existing markets. And it's not just the United States, it's every industrial society, and it's not new. It goes back to the origins of the Industrial Revolution. It's what you might call really existing market theory. And these examples are good ones. Well, of course, the business world thinks this is a terrific arrangement. Why shouldn't they? When you look at particular cases, you get a clearer sense of the way it works. So take, say, the leaders of the conservative revolution in Congress. The leader in the House is Newt Gingrich, who's full of eloquent rhetoric about the work ethic and making sure people get off the cycle of dependency. And, 7-year-old children have to know that nobody's going to give you a gift and that kind of business. He also, year after year, keeps the record for bringing federal subsidies to his rich constituents in Cobb County, Georgia, suburb of Atlanta. It happens to be a region where the state role in the economy, government role, meaning public role, is unusually extensive, but he's champion. Again, to be precise, he's third. Arlington, Virginia, which is part of Washington, gets more federal subsidies. That's where the Pentagon is and places like that. And Brevard County, Florida, which is the home of the Kennedy Space Center, that gets more public subsidies. But apart from them, Gingrich, year after year, is the record for suburban districts. The main employer in his district is that noted exponent of free markets, Lockheed Martin, a publicly subsidized corporation. In fact, every American household, the average household pays about a $200 a year Lockheed Martin tax to make sure that the rich folk down there don't break the cycle of dependency. Even with the public support, Lockheed practically went broke in the early 70s. So it was rescued by a $250 million bailout by the Nixon administration. It was that action that led Senator Proxmire to coin the phrase corporate welfare. Well, okay, that's the leader of the conservative revolution in the House. How about the leader in the Senate, Trent Lott, Senate Republican leader? I'll just quote the staid and quite proper Financial Times, the leading financial journal in the world from London, had a headline reading, "Most Successful Pork Producer of 1997. Then goes on with a story about Trent Lott. It continues like this. If you take, say, the CEO of Citicorp, Walter Wriston, the man who more or less invented, huge loans to the third world, which led to the third world debt crisis and so on. He's a great exponent of the free market and laissez-faire, and very proud of the fact that markets can now set social policy. They're so powerful, so you don't have to worry about democratic states anymore. On the other hand, when the whole thing went bust in 1982, he was quite happy to be bailed out by the public when the third world debts were socialized and the commercial banks were essentially paid off in various indirect ways by taxpayers, and of course by the victims who paid for it. So the laissez-faire doctrine disappeared. It's a little more to that story. Wriston's entrepreneurial techniques included, in fact, a large part of the bank's profits were based on fraudulent schemes worked out in Brazil, which were declared illegal by the Internal Revenue Service. But that was no big problem. The IRS was overruled by William Simon, another great believer in the free market. He was then Secretary of the Treasury, and he shortly after resigned and joined the board of directors of Citicorp. Well, that's the way the real world works. But that's on the other hand, there's the picture world that you're taught about. As I say, there's nothing really new about this, but there are changes. It goes way back in the beginning of American history in England before it. But there have been changes. There was a major change around the Second World War, the Depression and the Second World War. The Depression of the 1930s made it very clear to anyone who had any lingering illusions about the matter that there's no conceivable possibility for free market capitalism to work. I mean, nobody really believed it much anyway, but that put an end to it. The New Deal measures took some of the edge off the Depression, but not very much. I mean, they made people feel better and that sort of thing, but the effects were about the same. There was not much difference in 1939 and 1929. What did cure the Depression was the war. The war created a command economy or a semi-command economy. Market principles were put to the side. Corporate executives flocked to Washington and organized a state-controlled economy, which was extremely successful. American industrial production tripled, depression over. Resources were allocated, wages and prices, mainly wages, were controlled, and it was extremely effective, and it taught lessons. In particular, it taught lessons to the guys who ran the economy. They didn't have to read about Keynes in textbooks. They had just seen it. Here was a organized state-controlled economy which had plenty of private profit. So Boeing Corporation, for example, took off, doing its patriotic duty by making huge profits after it barely survived before. And the lesson was very clear, and it was understood. It was assumed almost universally by businessmen, by economists and others, that the country was going to sink right back into recession after the war, unless the government stepped in. And if you go back and read the business press in those days, Fortune, Business Week, and so on, they were pretty frank about it. So Fortune explained that high-tech industry, I'm quoting, they were talking about aeronautical industry, but then they generalized to all high-tech industry, cannot survive in a competitive, unsubsidized, free enterprise economy, and the government must be the savior, Business Week added. And it goes on like that in the business press. The only question was how to do it. What's the best way for government to step in, to be the savior, and to protect advanced industry from competitive economies? Well, it was understood there are a lot of ways of doing it. So it could be, say, social spending or full employment policies, building schools and hospitals and that kind of thing. That would do it. And it was discussed, but it was rejected because policies like that, though they would work, have a downside. For one thing, they tend to be democratizing. So people care about things like schools and hospitals. They haven't any opinion about, jet fighters and missiles and that kind of thing. So that's a much better cover for pouring subsidies into high-tech industry without the fear of democracy. Furthermore, social spending tends to be somewhat redistributive, whereas using the Pentagon funnel is just a pure gift to corporate sector. There's no redistributive or democratizing effect. And for reasons like that, which are discussed in the business press, the method that was hit upon was the Pentagon, Department of Energy, NASA, national laboratories, AEC, essentially that part of the state sector, which operates mostly in secret. It's also easier to sell. Very easy to sell. All you have to do is terrorize the public. So they cower in fear, and have to be protected while you're pouring money into advanced technology and so on. And that was done quite successfully. That's a good bit of the history of the last 50 years. Again, all of this goes back to the origins of the U.S. economy, but there isn't any time to talk about it now, though it's an interesting story. So, for example, American mass production methods, which were real innovation, were developed in national armories, in the Springfield Armory, back in the 1820s and 1830s, when they developed interchangeable parts and mass production techniques and so on. And the same is true of a good part of the early Industrial Revolution, railroads and so on. And again, it's not just the United States. This is standard. Well, all of this goes on right to the present. It's not just advanced technology, advanced industry. The same is true of things like management techniques, what's called management science these days. During the 1970s, there were very severe management failures in the United States, and there was a lot of concern about the low level of productivity and investment and the failure of incompetent U.S. management to keep up with more advanced methods that were being developed in primarily Japan, but also Europe. And those of you with long enough memories will recall that that was a period when there was a call for the reindustrialization of America. We got to do something about this problem and so on. Well, the Pentagon is listening. They understand their role in the economy to be a funnel for public funds for, revitalizing a failed private enterprise economy, private enterprise in quotes. And they responded with a program of what was called management technology, ManTech. The goal of the ManTech project of the 70s was to design, I'm quoting, the factory of the future, to integrate computer technology and automation in production and design, to develop flexible manufacturing technology, and to develop methods of management efficiency. The goal of ManTech, I'm quoting Pentagon, was to boost the market share and industrial leadership of U.S. industry in the traditional way, by state initiative, public subsidy, socializing costs, taxpayer funding, and handing it over as gifts to the private sector, which had failed so totally in keeping up with what was happening in the world economy. There was a side benefit to this. The factory of the future was designed in such a way that it can reduce the workforce and control the workforce. So, for example, one part of it is automation, like numerical control, computer control of machine tools and so on. Now, that was a highly inefficient system. It had to be designed in the state sector, with you paying for it. And for a long time, it was designed in, the Air Force and so on. But it was designed, and finally, when it got to work, it was handed over to private enterprise. But it was designed in a very special way. When systems are designed within the state sector, which is essentially the corporate sector, the power that protects the corporate sector and is largely governed by it, then it's designed in a special way. So there's nothing inherent in automation that says it ought to de-skill workers. So the computer-controlled machine tools could have been developed. This is studied very well by David Noble in particular. Could have been developed in such a way as to empower machinists and to get rid of useless levels of management. But in fact, it was designed the opposite way, to increase management control and to de-skill workers. That's not for economic efficiency. That's for class war again. And that's what happens when things are designed in secret, undercover by your funds, but through the state corporate alliance. And the factory of the future is similar. Well, this was the 70s. During the Reagan administration in the 80s, the ManTech program rapidly expanded. The Reagan administration went far beyond the norm in violating market principles for the rich, also in rhetoric about the marvels of the market for the poor. Those two things usually go together. So they rapidly increased the ManTech program, but a lot of other things too. The research, the main research branch of the Pentagon, DARPA, Advanced Research Project Agencies, it got more involved, which had developed the internet and information technology and so on since the 60s, the background of it. They got involved in promoting new technology in computer design, particularly in massively parallel computing, which was just coming along. That's the sort of core part of supercomputers and so on, information technology, etc. And they also got directly involved in market interference under the Reaganites for the first time, setting up startup companies. There's a review of this in Science Magazine, the journal of the American Association for Advancement of Science, which points out that during the Reagan administration, DARPA became a pivotal market force, transferring new technologies to nascent industries, like the startups around Silicon Valley, which sort of took off from that, just the way the big technology corridor around Boston took off in the 50s and the 60s, a spin-off from MIT and military labs and other ways of, other modalities for funneling public funds and new technologies developed in the state sector over to private industry. Well, that's more, really existing market theory. The Reagan administration went far beyond that. It was the most protectionist administration in post-war history, in fact, more protectionist than all other administrations combined. It doubled protective barriers. The purpose was to keep out superior Japanese products in the steel and automotive and semiconductor and computer industries to save American industries, which had basically collapsed because of management failure. And not only to save them, but to develop new technology for them so that they would be in a dominant position for the future. That's what's now called the triumph of the market in the 1990s, thanks to huge public subsidy, public sector innovation and development, protection, very high levels of protection, plenty of straight bailouts, like Continental Illinois was the famous of them, and so on. That's the way the market works. It's kind of amazing to watch this transmuted through the ideological system until it gets into courses in universities and, stories in the New York Times and so on. It's natural enough when you think about it that the rich should demand protection from market discipline. That's for poor people, not for rich people. And that's understandable. And it's even more understandable that rich and powerful sectors should fear democracy. After all, democracy is what could undermine their power. And that's a long story as well, always taking new forms. Just keeping to this century, the history is interesting too, but no time. In this century, in the 1920s, it looked as if the beast had really been tamed. The labor movement was crushed, mostly by violence. We have an extremely violent labor history in the United States, quite unlike other industrial countries. But the labor movement was indeed crushed in the 1920s. In the period of mass industrialization, there was virtually no labor role, something which amazed foreigners who visited here, even right-wing ones. There's a book, the leading academic labor historian in the United States, David Montgomery at Yale, has a book called The Fall of the House of Labor. And the fall that he's talking about is the 1920s, when it looked like it was dead. It was kind of end of history, utopia of the masters and all that sort of thing. Montgomery points out in the book that modern America was created over its workers' protests. Working people had to make their peace with a most undemocratic America with no voice at all to speak of in the period of mass industrialization, mass production. Well, that was the 1920s. Looked like the game is over. A couple of years later, the place was pre-revolutionary. Workers were on the verge of taking over factories. That's what sit-down strikes are. And in general, the beast escaped the cage. Forced the United States into something like the mainstream of the conservative industrial world with protections, some conventional protections that it didn't have before for rights of labor and human rights generally, and the germs of what we call the welfare state. Well, a good part of the business world was appalled by all of this. The National Association of Manufacturers, in its internal literature, warned of, quoting, the hazards facing industrialists and the rising political power of the masses. Incidentally, when you read the business press, it typically reads like Maoist pamphlets. They're really the only real Marxists. They just have it all turned around. So phrases like the rising political power of the masses are not unusual in the business press. And they are hazards facing industrialists. And they took pretty strong action to try to counter this threat of democracy. It was put on hold during the war, but taken up with a tremendous vigor and intensity right after the war. There was a campaign started right away to roll back labor rights, I'm quoting from manuals, to regiment the minds of men just as an army regiments their bodies. There was organization of immense propaganda campaigns to wage and win what they called the everlasting battle of the minds of men and to indoctrinate them with the capitalist story. Quotes, the campaign was huge. It involved a huge public relations industry. That's a U.S. creation, which is an enormous industry. The entertainment industry was enlisted. It targeted schools, universities, churches, captive audiences in factories, even sports leagues. Almost nothing was left out. It was a major campaign with plenty of money behind it and so on, starting right off in the 40s. There were a number of major themes. One theme was to demonize unions. Well, that's obvious. Unions are a democratizing force. They have always been in the lead of extending the social contract, and furthermore, they represent these bad people, working people. So demonizing unions is a major theme. That's been driven into everyone's head in the movies and everything else ever since. A second and somewhat more complex task was to demonize government. But there you have to be careful because you have to demonize those aspects of government that work for the general population, but meanwhile preserve and even extend those parts which are working for rich and powerful people, like the kinds of things I was talking about. So you have to have, Reaganite fantasies about welfare mothers, but nothing about Trent Lott and Newt Gingrich and Walter Wriston and William Simon and, Bill Gates and so on and so forth. So that's a little subtle, more tricky propaganda. But if you're, not beyond the capacities of the public relations industry and the media and so on. A third task is kind of more general, and that is to try to induce just passivity among the population in hopelessness. You're all victims of huge forces, nothing you can do about it. And also to try to privatize aspirations, to get rid of this terrible idea that sort of, we're all in it together and we should work together to achieve something for all of us. Got to get rid of that and replace it by just, me first, I don't care what happens to anyone else, that sort of thing. That's deeply inhuman. It takes a lot of work to drive normal human sentiments out of people's minds. But there's been a 50 or 60-year effort very serious effort to do this. And, if you think about it, you'll find plenty of examples in your daily life. Well, there were victories. In the 1950s, it looked as if it was back to the 20s, end of history, beast caged, etc. Well, it blew up again in the 60s. Incidentally, this is a constant cycle. Things may look hopeless, but they've looked a lot worse before and never were hopeless. In the 60s, everything blew up, as you know. That set off what was called a crisis of democracy. Actually, it's an interesting book with that title. If you haven't read it, you ought to. The book was not intended to be read, so therefore you can guess that it's worth reading, and it is. It was the first and really only serious publication of the Trilateral Commission. That was a commission set up by David Rockefeller in 1973. There are a lot of illusions about it, about how it runs the world and so on. Actually, it's extremely boring. But this book happens to be interesting. It was published in 1975. The Trilateral Commission is elite elements from the trilateral countries. That's like your triad. They're called Europe, Japan, the United States, the rich guys. And this was liberal elites. The right wing is much harsher. These are kind of the soft humanist end of the spectrum. The people who were around Jimmy Carter, his administration came out of that. So their book is about the crisis of democracy and very well worth reading. Gives you an understanding of how elite elements think about you. The crisis of democracy that took place in the 1960s occurred when normally passive and apathetic people got this strange idea of trying to enter into the political arena to press their interests. They forgot that they are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders and that their role is to be spectators, not participants in action, as progressive democratic theory in the Wilson era and afterwards had explained. The American contributor, the American rapporteur, a distinguished Harvard professor, pointed out with kind of a little bit of nostalgia that back in the Truman era, before the crisis of democracy, Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a few Wall Street lawyers and financiers, some phrase like that. Exaggeration, obviously, but that was you get the point. And then there was no crisis of democracy. Democracy was working the way it was supposed to. But in the 60s, you started getting all this popular mobilization and people trying to get involved in doing things for themselves and one another, and that had to be beaten back. And in fact, since the 1970s, there has been another enormous campaign to try to overcome the crisis of democracy. Particularly troublesome to the Trilateral Commission was what they called the lapses of the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. their phrase, meaning the schools, the universities, the churches, they were really kind of failing their task. And one part of the post-crisis campaign since the 70s, huge funding and propaganda and so on, is to try to overcome the failures of indoctrination and the crisis of democracy and the hazards facing private power from the rising political power of the masses and in general when people forget their proper role. This attack on democracy has been greatly facilitated by quite important changes in the international economic order that have taken place, in fact, right around that time. After World War II, an international economic order was established. It's called the Bretton Woods system. It was by mainly the United States. It was the United States and England, primarily the U.S. It was based on two principles. One principle was to try to free trade, to liberalize trade. The other principle was to regulate capital, to regulate finance. The reason for the second principle was, in fact, if you look at the IMF rules, it's hard to believe, but the IMF rules up till today not only allow countries to regulate capital flow, but prohibit credits by the IMF to countries that are using the credits to overcome capital flight. You wouldn't believe it if you look at IMF procedures, but those are the rules. Disobeyed, of course, but remember, the laws are for poor people, not for rich people. Why regulate finance? Well, there were two basic reasons for that. One is a general understanding, which is probably correct and is reasonably well supported in recent years, that liberalization of finance tends to undermine freedom of trade. They're kind of incompatible, sometimes called the incompatibility thesis. A second, and this is not really questionable, is that it was understood that liberalization of finance provides a very powerful weapon against democracy and against social programs, the welfare state, for very simple reasons. I mean, if a country tries to introduce, say, full employment programs or social spending or stimulate its economies or whatever, if it cannot control capital flows, capital is going to flow out of it, to places that are not carrying out these heresies. Interest rates will have to go up and the whole thing will collapse. In fact, what liberalization of finance does is create what some international economists have called a virtual Senate, a Senate of powerful financial sectors that can essentially set policies for governments and punish those who deviate. The Bretton Woods system, based on these principles, was in fact in force through what's called the golden age of the high growth, up till around 1970, golden age of modern state capitalism, high growth of the economy, of productivity, extensions of the social contract, and so on, all within this system. Well, that was dismantled by Richard Nixon in the early 70s with the support of Britain, later other major powers. Finance was liberalized, and it had pretty much the expected effects. This, as was predicted at once, this was a period of, led to a period of low growth, low productivity, low wages, huge profits, in fact, the current period. There was also a huge increase in capital exchanges and foreign exchange transactions, capital flow across countries. It went from about $18 billion a day in 1977 to over 1.3 trillion by the mid-90s. I mean, these numbers are all approximate, but nobody really knows, but roughly of that order, so like 100, factor of 100. Furthermore, the composition changed radically. You go back to 1970, about 90% of international capital exchanges were related to the real economy. They were for investment or trade or something like that, 10% speculation. Now it's maybe 5% related to the real economy. The rest is speculation and concerning interest rate differences and the exchange rate differences and so on. Most of it is extremely short term. The bank for International Settlements, the main monitor of international banking in Switzerland, estimates that about 80% of it has a turnaround time of a week, meaning investment and most of that's within a day or even hours. Well, all of that is an attack on the real economy, but it does create very high profits for the financial sectors, which are growing enormously. It has also increased very sharply the volatility of markets. There's wild fluctuations, financial crises, quite unpredictable. They've been increasing very fast. The bailouts get bigger and bigger all the time, and so on, to the point where even very conservative sectors are calling for regulation. So the Bank for International Settlements and the chief economist of the World Bank, Joseph Stiglitz, and others of that type are saying, look, even Greenspan recognizes, look, we got to do something about this. It's probably getting out of hand. It's also brought about, as predicted at the Bretton Woods period, it's brought about constraints on trade. This has not been a period of growth of trade. On the contrary, it's been a period of sustained assault on free trade. It's quoting from the head of economic research at the World Trade Organization in a sort of technical study of this period. He incidentally estimates the effect of Reaganite barriers to trade as about 3 times the level of other industrial countries, which were also quite serious. Furthermore, what is called trade is very heavily managed. So for the United States, rough estimates are that about 40% of what's called trade is actually internal to a corporation. So it's like the Ford Motor Company sending parts to Mexico to get assembled and sent back here inside the corporation, crosses a border, so it's called trade. If it went from Indiana to Illinois, it wouldn't be called trade, but it's as much trade in one case as the other. And that's a substantial component, roughly 40%. Generally accepted estimate is that about maybe 15% of world trade could be called free in some serious sense. Meanwhile, the attack on democracy continues. Let me end with that. Am I running over too much? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me end with some comments on the attack on democracy, in which some quite significant things are happening undercover. Let's just keep to the trade treaties. Take NAFTA. You recall that NAFTA was going to do all sorts of marvelous things. Remember, fantastic boon to the economy and so on and so forth. All of that's been abandoned. There is now what's called an expert view, the view of the Clinton administration. The expert view now is that NAFTA had no significant effect at all. And they're sort of bemoaning the fact that there are all these people like the labor movement who claim that it's harmful. They say, no, it really hasn't been harmful. In fact, no effect. A little different than their story back in 1992, but that's the current expert view. Of course, there's that when they say no effect, they mean no effect that they count. Like they don't count the effect of NAFTA on, say, illegal strike breaking and intimidation of workers and significant wage restraint and so on and so forth. It's now, in fact, conceded that the critics who were kept out of the debate totally were right all along. Now you can read not only in the marginal press, but even in foreign affairs, that the purpose of NAFTA was to lock Mexico into the reforms of the 1980s. The reforms were a disaster for the population of the people of Mexico, but they were great for Mexicans in the sense in which Americans are smug and prosperous, and also for foreign investors. It was necessary to lock Mexico into those so-called reforms. Whenever you hear the word reform, you should begin to shudder. I mean, like Pol Pot carried out changes, but we don't call them reforms. Reforms are the ones you're supposed to like, like the ones that reduced wages in Mexico by about 50% while creating a huge, boom in billionaires and so on. Anyhow, it was necessary to lock Mexico into those reforms. That's now conceded, exactly as was pointed out at the time. Yet to be conceded, and is what I suspect is the background, which was brought out in a Latin American strategy development workshop in Washington in 1990. The minutes were published, high-level meeting about U.S. relations with Latin America, it concluded that relations with the Mexican dictatorship, it is a brutal dictatorship, that relations with the Mexican dictatorship were excellent, but there were potential problems. The problem that worried them is, quote, a democracy opening in Mexico might bring into office a government more interested in challenging the United States on economic and nationalist grounds. United States here is to be understood like Americans, doesn't mean, okay. And we got to watch that. But now the threat of a democracy opening in Mexico is essentially overcome because they're locked into these reforms by a treaty that they can't get out of. So that's the achievement of NAFTA. There are some other achievements like the ones I mentioned. NAFTA is called a North American Free Trade. It stands for North American Free Trade Agreement, right? The only accurate words in that phrase are North American. It's not a free trade agreement. It's highly protectionist. Part of the protectionism, in fact, is part of the reason why your HMO won't allow you to get drugs, because they're too costly. They're too costly because, in large part, because they're protected by essentially monopoly prices. NAFTA and the World Trade Organization agreements introduced unprecedented protection for drug companies and others, which allows them, in fact, to charge super high prices. Now a big problem for medical treatment. They claim that they need that protection because they have to have high profits for research and development, but that can't possibly be true. About half the research and development is paid for by the public anyway. And if that were doubled, it would be a slight effect. The effect on the cost to consumers of this high level of protection, I know of only one technical paper that's tried to estimate it by economist Dean Baker at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington. He estimates the cost of protection at being roughly in the neighborhood of 50 times the total gains expected from the GATT agreements. That's a huge amount. It's just for pharmaceuticals. And he points out, look, if we doubled the payment for research and development that the public's paying, still be a huge bargain for the public if you remove protection altogether. Anyhow, these are highly protectionist agreements. In fact, they're a mixture of liberalization and protection for the benefit of, Americans and others like them in their other countries. So it's not a free trade agreement. In fact, it was certainly not an agreement. Canadians, real Canadians, were mostly against it, strongly against it, in fact, despite the huge propaganda in the United States. The public in the United States remained opposed, had to be put through over their protests. In Mexico, you can't really tell. It's a dictatorship, so they don't take public opinion polls. But from what you can gather, there was quite strong protest. There were big demonstrations. The Mexican bishops came out against it. A good part of the business community, especially middle-sized business, came out against it, chambers of commerce and so on, figuring they'd be overwhelmed, as they are, by, protected and subsidized American, U.S. competitors. In any event, it certainly wasn't an agreement. In the United States, the original intent apparently was to try to get it through in secret. It was signed in August, middle of August, right in the middle of a presidential campaign, but with very little notice. It did reach the public, mainly because of agitation, a lot of grassroots agitation. And then came an interesting period of controlled discussion. There is a Trade Act in the United States passed by Congress in 1974, which requires that there be a labor input to any international trade treaty. The organization to turn to is the Labor Advisory Committee, and they were indeed notified of NAFTA. They were supposed to participate in the formation of it. They weren't, but they were notified of its existence on September 8th, about a month after it was signed. And they were told that they could submit a report if they like. It had to be due on September 9th. So the idea was to make sure that they didn't have a chance to meet, and put in the labor input. Surprisingly, they got together and met and put out a long and interesting and very constructive report. It's really worth reading. Labor Advisory Committee report on NAFTA. The conclusion was they were in favor of a NAFTA, but not this one. A North American Free Trade Agreement would be a good idea, but not an investor rights agreement. rather one that worked for other people too, like working people and concerned with the environment and so on. That report, and they had constructive proposals as to how to proceed with this. I couldn't find one word in the media about this. At the same time, the Office of Technology Assessment, which is Congress's own research bureau, came out with an analysis of NAFTA, which was very much the same. It was rather like the LAC report. It's on the public record, like if you're enterprising, you can discover it. It came out in favor of a NAFTA, but not this one, not an investor rights agreement. It had similar proposals. Well, the LAC report and the OTA report, as far as I'm aware, never made it to the debate. They never made it to the press. At the same time, labor was being denounced all over the place for, quote the New York Times, it's the backward, unenlightened labor movement with its crude, threatening tactics and narrow nationalism, and so on. That's quoting from the far left, incidentally, at this point, just for fairness. That's Anthony Lewis in the New York Times from the far left of the corporate media. That was the picture. The facts were never allowed in. That's a pretty impressive achievement in a free country. But it gets better. I should say that as we know, despite the huge propaganda effect, the public remained opposed, but they were just ignored. There are some things too important to be left to the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. Well, last fall we just went through another interesting phase of this in connection with fast track. The fast track was supposed to be about free trade, remember? Well, it certainly couldn't have been that. For one thing, the trade agreements they had in mind are not free trade agreements. Again, they have lots of protectionist elements. Furthermore, that wasn't even the issue. Fast track has to do with democracy, not trade. The question about fast track is, are decisions going to be rammed through without anybody knowing about it, or is there going to be public discussion and debate? Okay, in other words, is the public going to be allowed to know what the state corporate alliance is planning for it? That's what fast track is about. And the most enthusiastic advocate of free trade would also be opposed to fast track if they happen to believe in democracy. So that was the issue, democracy, not free trade, not trade at all. Furthermore, the major issue behind the fast track discussion, what I presume was the major issue, was never mentioned at all. The major issue was certainly not whether to bring Chile into NAFTA or something like that. The major issue was probably the multilateral agreement on investments, the MAI. That was described recently in Business Week in a story which was headlined, "The Explosive Trade Deal You've Never Heard of." And they're right. It's an explosive trade deal, and for most people, other than Americans in the technical sense, you've never heard of it. And that's an interesting fact. We can be quite certain that was what was behind the fast track. You have to guess because it's kept secret, but it looks as if that was what was behind the fast track issue. In fact, the U.S. Council for International Business, in its own words, it's the organization that advances the interests of American business at home and abroad. The council had called upon the Clinton administration to include the MAI within fast track, even before the fast track legislation was introduced. And suddenly the media knew all about this. This was actually published in the one story that appeared about it in the Miami Herald in summer 1997. But it was suppressed in the national press, and I couldn't find any mention of this or of the MAI altogether in the fast track debate. I have an article that's coming out soon that reviews a lot of the media coverage on this. I'll just sample it. Well, the MAI has been under intense negotiation since May 1995. That's about 3 years. It's at the OECD, the rich countries, hence in secret. It's been kept under a veil of secrecy, and borrow the phrase from the Sir Anthony Mason, the former Chief Justice of the Australian Supreme Court, who was condemning his government's refusal to permit a parliamentary scrutiny of this when the issue finally broke through in Australia, as it did in January this year. In Australia, it broke through. In Canada, the veil, and there's a big controversy since. In Canada, the veil was pierced earlier in mid-1997 by activists and the labor movement in particular, which had been trying to agitate about this, and they broke through. For about a year, it's been on national television and national press and journals and so on, north of the border. In Europe, it pretty much broke through this year, last couple of months, so now it's a big issue in Europe. The United States is unique. It's kind of interesting. The United States has been essentially nothing. There was the story I mentioned in the Miami Herald. Of course, there's stuff in the trade press. In fact, the U.S. Council for International Business actually put out a monograph about it in January 1996 for their constituency, explaining the MAI and where they should be interested. And the corporate sector and the council have been involved since the beginning. But it's been kept secret. It's impossible that, media leaders don't know about this. I mean, it's almost inconceivable. But it has been kept secret. There was the Miami Herald story. There was a story in the Chicago Tribune, which maybe some of you saw in December, not a bad story, which pointed out that there's been no discussion about this in the United States, which was correct. Last November, 25 members of Congress sent a letter to the White House saying it has come to our attention, presumably through the efforts of activists and public interest groups and so on, it has come to our attention that for almost 3 years, the White House has been carrying out intensive negotiations on the multilateral agreement on investment without informing Congress. And the representative asked how that could be true for several reasons. One, during this period, right as in the middle of the fast track debate, the Clinton administration was wailing about the fact that they can't carry out complicated trade negotiations without fast track. But this was an extremely complex negotiation. The draft treaty, which has been leaked, is about 150 pages long. It's been going on for 3 years, and somehow they were able to do it without fast track. Second point that the congressman raised is that Congress has exclusive authority to regulate international commerce under the Constitution, but they've never been informed. So how come? The third point they raised is sort of a technical one, is that the language of the MAI has takings terms. Takings means, rights of corporations. It has takings legislation which go way beyond U.S. law. That means it submits the United States to laws empowering corporations to, as it's called, enjoy their investments, do whatever they want with their investments, that go way beyond what's permitted in U.S. law. And how come this is going on in secret? What they may have had in mind, and probably did, is some of the exploratory efforts that are now underway under NAFTA rules by corporations to see, just has similar taking terms, to see how far this can be pressed. So the Ethel Corporation is famous for having poisoned people with lead for 50 years, knowing that it was poisonous. The Ethel Corporation is now suing Canada, $250 million suit against Canada, because the Canadian government is considering legislation to ban some ethyl additive that it's regarded as carcinogenic. It's already banned in many countries. It's banned outright in California. It's under heavy EPA restrictions. But Canada is considering banning it, and actually it's a little more complicated, effectively banning it. If you look at the details, a little different. And Ethel is suing them for expropriation by planning to ban this harmful additive, and also for defaming the Ethel Corporation, and also for interfering with their business, because Canada's efforts to ban it have spread to other countries like New Zealand and so on. So it's kind of interfering with ethyl investment. Well, that's under NAFTA rules, and they're kind of seeing how far they can push it. The MAI would carry it much further. There's another case underway right now. A U.S. hazardous waste disposal corporation, Metalclad, is suing Mexico for $90 million because the governor of the province of Mexico declared a certain area to be an ecological park, and Metalclad had been planning to use it for hazardous waste disposal. So they're suing Canada. That's another case that's now going through. These cases, incidentally, don't get dealt with in courts. They get dealt with in secret panels made up of what are called trade experts. You can imagine who they are. And their judgments are not appealable. There's no rules of evidence, none of that kind of stuff. And all of that is in the MAI, but generalized. That's one of its many features. Well, that's the third issue raised, the takings issue. They got a couple of months later, they got a sort of vacuous response from the White House of the kind that you will get if you write a letter asking about it, sort of meaningless response. There wasn't a word about this in the free press as far as I could see. But there is agitation going on. And it was enough so that in February 17th, this February, the White House did come out with an official statement, which received no notice in the press that I could find. The statement is interesting, and you should pay attention to it. It tells you something, again, about the way you're looked at. The statement says that, doesn't say anything about the MAI, but it emphasizes the importance of working closely with domestic constituencies to build a consensus on the MAI, and it stresses that the Clinton administration has been living up to the responsibility to ensure active participation of domestic constituencies that have a vital stake in this process. Okay, that's the crucial part of the statement. Well, let's have a look. Who are the domestic constituencies? Well, plainly not Congress. They haven't been informed. Plainly not the public. That's under a veil of secrecy. They don't know anything about it. But yes, the U.S. Council for International Business, they've been informed, in fact, very much involved, as is the corporate sector in general. So with a little exercise in logic, you can figure out who the domestic constituencies are. They turn out to be the same as the Americans, the ones who are smug and prosperous. They're the ones who cast over society the shadow called politics, and John Dewey's nice phrase. That's the domestic constituencies. Well, I could go on, but there isn't much time. Why has there been such secrecy? It has been remarkable. Incidentally, this treaty is due to be signed next week. April 27th is the due date. They're not going to make it because there's been too much public agitation, and they probably will not be able to get it through, in which case what you can expect is that they'll put it in a still more secret forum, namely the IMF, which is completely secret. And you can sort of work it into IMF rules somehow. So probably that's the next stage. But to keep an explosive treaty, what Businessweek rightly calls an explosive treaty, secret for 3 years, despite the fact that it's going to have enormous effects, or maybe because it's going to have enormous effects, that's a pretty impressive achievement in a free country. Nobody's got a gun pointed at anyone's head. This is self-discipline, dedicated self-discipline. The reasons for it are, I think, pretty obvious. The corporate world is overwhelmingly in favor of it. I mean, it frees up rights of investors beyond anything you can imagine, and eliminates that, most, the kinds of democratic decisions that some community, local, national, whatever, might impose on movement of capital or investment or living wages or anything you can think of. Those are all eliminated as violations of the treaty. The corporate world is strongly in favor of it. It's fair to guess that the sector of the corporate world called the media is also strongly in favor of it. You can't prove it because they don't say anything, but chances are they're in favor of it. And they know perfectly well that the public is going to be opposed. The reasons came out during the fast track debate. The Wall Street Journal had an interesting article where they were bemoaning the fact that fast track probably wasn't going to get through. And they said the problem is that the opponents of fast track, although they're totally crazy, kind of flat earthers and so on, but they have what the journal called an ultimate weapon. The ultimate weapon is that the population is against it and can't be shut up somehow, despite all efforts. And the ultimate weapon would come into operation again if this were made public, so that's secret. Corporations had already been granted the rights of persons early in this century by radical judicial activism, radical violation of natural rights, classical liberal doctrines, and so on. The new treaty, the MAI, is going to grant them the rights of states. They have the right to sue states, governments, that is, national governments, local governments, and so on. There's no reciprocity, like nobody can sue them. In fact, all obligations in the treaty fall upon people and their governments. No obligations fall upon corporations. The treaty has what they call a ratchet effect, which results from two things, a standstill and rollback. A standstill means once you sign it, you're not allowed to introduce any legislation that might conflict with rights of investors. Rollback means you have to get rid of the legislation you already have that conflicts with them. There's a 20-year lock for signers during which the ratchet effect takes place. It essentially frees investors from minimal obligations that might be imposed by democratic communities. I don't have time to talk about it, but it's worth informing yourselves about. Remember, this is due to be signed a week from now, though it probably won't be, after 3 years of negotiation under a virtual veil of secrecy. In the other industrial countries, it has become a public issue. In the United States, it's still been kept very quiet. It is indeed the explosive treaty that you've never heard about for almost anyone, except public interest groups, which have been working very hard on it and have put a leaked draft treaty on the internet and so on. There's a few breaks which I could mention, but there's no time. Well, where's all this going? It's pretty clear where it's aiming. The goal is to have an international political economy which is organized by powerful states and secret bureaucracies like the IMF. Their primary function is going to be to serve the interests of concentrations of private power, basically tyrannies, removed from public scrutiny, unaccountable to the public. You can't find out what they're up to, even by law. They administer markets through their internal operations, through complicated networks of corporate alliances, intra-firm transactions that are mislabeled trade, and so on. They're going to rely on the public, as always, for subsidy, for research and development, innovation, bailouts, defense against ominous democracy openings, and that sort of thing. The scale of all of this is by no means as great as is claimed. They claim that this is something radically new as part of the effort to induce hopelessness. It's not all that new. And there isn't any reason at all to doubt that it's controllable. In fact, controllable within existing parliamentary mechanisms in the rich countries. There's no mysterious economic laws that are operating. There are just very specific human decisions. They're made in human institutions. They're kept secret out of threat of the ultimate weapon, which can act if it so chooses. The decisions can be modified. They can be challenged. They can be reversed. The institutions themselves, like any institutions, have to face the test of legitimacy. If they do not meet that test, and that's for the public to decide, then they can be replaced by others that are more free and more just. That's been happening throughout history, and there's no reason to think that it should stop now.
So with that, we'll go to the question and answer phase. And who wants to jump into the barrel first?
Any technique for doing this? Or?
This is totally unorganized.
Okay.
The last thing we're going to have is organization.
Tom, why don't you pick people since you can see them?
First hand,
And somebody else on the other, somebody on the other side. Is there somebody on the other side?
I think you accurately termed what's going on as class warfare, and you've also accurately identified the motivation and leadership of, I guess, our opponents, as you would say, in that warfare. For instance, Lippmann, the Trilateral Commission, even Gingrich and Reagan. I was wondering who, the motivation for us is obvious, our own survival and betterment of our lives, but who would you say, I guess, the leadership and ideology, at least in terms of being truly liberatory forces in our lives. What kind of forces do you see going on today in terms of the movement of ideas and even action?
Well, there's a huge public agitation over all these things. I mean, take fast track. Up until very recently, every president had fast track authority. Okay, that lapsed for rather briefly, and the Clinton administration argued correctly that it was just trying to reinstitute what had always existed. Fast track is radically undemocratic. Up until quite recently, it was never challenged. This time, it was challenged so strongly by the ultimate weapon that they couldn't ram it through. Well, that's a reflection of the fact that there's been a change in mentality and understanding. There is a crisis of democracy. People are more involved, more interested, more concerned, more distrustful. It's kind of, almost instinctive. It's unorganized. It's part of a big cultural change in the country that's taken place since the 60s, which is quite far-reaching. I mean, it extends to all sorts of things, like, if you look at the big popular movements, which have really had an effect on the society, they actually are not from the 60s, they're from later, like the feminist movement or the environmental movements or the human rights movements and so on and so forth. These are all post-60s. But they kind of grew out of that, and they've just extended all over the place, and they've changed the way people think about things. And so much so that, for example, a provision that was always just there without anybody questioning it, namely the president does whatever he feels like and doesn't tell anybody, is now challenged, and challenged so much they can't ram it through. Well, that's the result of lots of effort and agitation. Some of it's organized, but not much. And most of it's a very chaotic society, and there isn't much in the way of the structure of organization. The reason it broke through in Canada and not here is primarily because they have an active labor movement. And with offshoots, including a political, kind of an umbrella political organization that brings together a lot of activist groups. We don't have that here. The labor movement has been under harsh attack since the 50s, and it's had an effect. Same reason why they have health insurance, national health programs, and we don't. It's a lot of things like that. But the forces are there. As to the right ideas, well, I have my ideas, I have yours, but I think the main thing we ought to be asking ourselves is, one thing that has to be done is to defend, the social contract that had been gained. And there have been big gains. Like now, it's a problem to defend the limited health protection system we have. But remember, 40 years ago, that wasn't a problem because there was no system. Okay. In fact, struggles today can start from a higher level because there have been gains. So the first thing to do is protect the gains. The next thing to do is to extend them. And the third thing to do is to ask about the legitimacy of the institutions that are carrying this out. I mean, why should we agree to have private tyrannies that are granted any rights at all? Here I'm going to say something critical of critics of the MAI, myself included. I too criticize the treaty because it gives corporations too many rights, which it does. But in the case of say kings or slave owners or party dictatorships or whatever, the right, it's not correct. It's inappropriate to say that they're granted too many rights. The question is why they should have any rights. You can ask them to become more benevolent, but that's not the right. And sometimes, pleading with the king to become more benevolent works. But that's really not the basic question. The question is why authority should be vested in the hands of unaccountable concentrations of power, which are internally tyrannical and have been granted incredible rights just by courts. Why should they have those rights at all? Why shouldn't they be under democratic control and accountable to the public? Run by their workforce, accountable to communities, and so on. Those are not particularly radical ideas, I should say. That's mainstream American thought. That was these were the major mainstream ideas, for example, of the American labor movement right through the 19th century, that those who work in the mills should own them. This was, the Republican Party 150 years ago, its slogan was that wage labor is not very different from chattel slavery. You could read Ed Torres in the New York Times after the Civil War saying that, well, we've gotten rid of chattel slavery, but now we're introducing wage slavery, which isn't all that different. This stuff is as American as apple pie. You don't need foreign agitators or anything else. And these are healthy elements of the tradition, roots back in the Enlightenment and classical liberalism. We should revive them and adapt them to present circumstances. I think that's the long-term test. But, that's my view. You've got to figure out your view.
Professor Noam Chomsky. My name is Suleiman Bourada. I'm originally from Lebanon. I'm now an Arab American and an internationalist, a democratic socialist by conviction. Since I came to this country, I have been puzzled, almost completely puzzled by the distorted view of the news media in this country about the true nature of the conflict in the Middle East and the role of the United States in the Middle East, as well as around the world, but particularly in the Middle East, because I came from the Middle East and I witnessed the true nature of the struggle in the Middle East. Could you please shed some light on the subject matter and, in your opinion, tell us what the American public should know and what can be done by labor and the American people in pursuance of justice in the Middle East?
Well, Middle East is a lot of different conflicts. And the main issue in the Middle East about the United States and the Middle East since the Second World War has been pretty straightforward. The Middle East happens to contain the world's cheapest and most abundant energy reserves. And since the Second World War, the United States has been determined to control them. That's kind of like, I once called it Axiom 1 of U.S. foreign policy, which isn't far from true. Whoever controls the immense energy reserves of the region has plenty of power in the world. And the U.S. in effect tried to extend the Monroe Doctrine to the Middle East after World War II. And that's sort of the core of U.S. policy. And most other things kind of flow from it in one way or another. Then come plenty of other conflicts. I mean, the major issue that reaches the public on the Middle East has to do with the Israel-Arab conflict. Especially since 1967, Israel's been essentially an appendage to the United States. It's what the Nixon administration called one of the cops on the beat that helps control the population of the region and make sure they don't do anything funny. Other cops on the beat at the time were Iran under the Shah, Turkey, Pakistan, mainly non-Arab countries. The idea is that they are better at suppressing and killing Arabs. So the way the system was supposed to be run, the oil resources themselves were to be controlled by weak, tyrannical states, what the British used to call an Arab facade when they were running the region, behind which the British would exert real control. So the family dictatorships of the Gulf, they can sort of manage the resources, but they got to be protected from their own populations. I mean, the people of the Middle East have funny ideas too. A lot of them don't understand why all the resources and wealth of that region should flow to wealthy Westerners, and not to them, And you have to have forces around that beat those funny ideas out of their head. Like maybe they'll have democracy openings and things. And that's what the local cops on the beat are for. And they were always in alliance. Like there was an close alliance between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Iran during the period of the Shah, with the U.S. in the background. A lot of active local politics there kind of reflects this structure. So take this thing called the peace process in the Middle East. I mean, it's a kind of a peace process, but when South Africa imposed the Bantustan program in the early 60s, that was a peace process too. They set up black states run by black people, called Transkei and so on and so forth. In fact, if the U.S. had openly backed that, it would have been called a peace process. As good a reason to be called a peace process as this one. If you want to know what this peace process is, just look at the writings of people who support it. Like, for example, Anthony Lewis again. I mean, he's a good choice because he's at the kind of dissident extreme of the American press. So, therefore, you learn something. He had an article about a week ago, which was the standard article denouncing the Netanyahu government in Israel for undermining the peace process and talking about I forget his exact words, but the stunning honesty of the old soldier Rabin, who recognized that the solution to the problem is to grant the Palestinians, here I'm virtually this close to a quote, a viable state, tiny, poor, controlled by Israel, but their own. Any South African racist could have said the same thing in 1960. Yeah, a Bantustan program. Tiny, impoverished, controlled by Israel, but their own. That's an equitable solution between two national groups that claim the same territory. Well, that's at the extreme dissident left, of American policy. And if you want to call that thing a peace process, okay, but it was designed explicitly as a Bantustan process, and that's exactly what it is. It's designed to grant our appendage, our cop on the beat, essentially whatever it wants. The resources of the region, the water, the territory it needs, and so on and so forth, and maybe allow the indigenous population, a tiny, impoverished thing that you can call a state, just like Transkei was called a state under the domination of Israel. The United States had in fact held that position in international isolation since 1971. When the U.S. broke out of the international consensus on this issue. And from about 1971, in fact exactly 1971 up until the Gulf War in 1991, the U.S. held this position in international isolation. The U.S. was compelled to veto Security Council resolutions. It voted alone with Israel year after year. Sometimes they'd pick up, Uzbekistan or somebody, essentially alone at the General Assembly against resolutions calling for a political settlement. This went on year after year after year. Almost none of it was reported in the press, but it was happening. And finally, with the Gulf War, the U.S. essentially, actually George Bush put it rather well. While the missiles and bombs were falling in Iraq, he said, he announced what he called his New World Order with a slogan, and the slogan is, "What we say goes." Okay, people got the message, Europe backed off, the third world disappeared, the Arab states were in total disarray, and the U.S. was able to ram through its own ultra-rejectionist program, which we call the peace process. You can be for it or against it or whatever you like, but it would be nice to recognize what it is, to allow discussion of this issue. I don't think there's any doubt about what I just said. It's easy to document, and in fact has been documented, but try to find any reference to any discussion of it in mainstream discourse. Can't. Well, that's this is the issue that is the focus of attention, but I think it's in the background of much broader issues. Just say a word about those much broader issues, which are also not properly discussed. They came to the fore during this latest Iraq crisis. I mean, it was impossible to suppress the fact that the United States and its sort of British puppy dog were acting alone on this issue. Nobody was supporting them. The U.S. and Britain were acting completely unilaterally. They could not get the support of the Security Council. The people of the region were strongly opposed. The only state in the region that was willing to give even tepid support to bombing Iraq, and it was pretty tepid, was Kuwait. The rest were strongly opposed. And they made their opposition clear. It may not have been reported here, but it's certainly clear to the State Department. So, for example, Saudi Arabia is the main, the linchpin of the whole business because they have most of the oil. When Albright went to Saudi Arabia, they kind of gave her the back of their hand. They didn't barely talk to her. At the very same time, Rafsanjani, Iranian former president, went to Saudi Arabia. He was given a royal state visit. He met the king, all kinds of things. And that was a pretty clear signal. Iran and Saudi Arabia are technically at war. They've been enemies for a long time. But Saudi Arabia was informing the United States that there's a limit beyond which you're not going to be able to push us. And if worst comes to worst, we may accept Iranian initiatives to set up regional security arrangements from which you won't dominate. That's a serious problem, and it's going to get much more serious in the coming years. Nobody thinks about it much. because there's sort of an ideology, a religion, a dominant religion, which says everything will be taken care of by the market. So autopilot, forget about everything. But of course, that's total nonsense. One of the things that's not going to be taken care of by the market is the fact that oil is a finite resource. Oil discoveries have been declining since about 1965. There's been a steady decline in new oil discoveries. They were rising up until then from the 19th century. That's despite fancy new technology and deep drilling and so on and so forth. And the probable reason for it is that most of it's been discovered that's usable. And if you kind of extrapolate, what the likely resources are, there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, the oil companies probably know, but they're tyrannical systems. They don't tell anybody, and they're unaccountable. You can't ask them any questions, any more than you could ask a king a question. But so they probably know, but they're not telling anybody. But others who are trying to figure it out estimate that we may be coming to the point where, say, half the available oil has been used at an accelerating pace because it's being used much faster in the last, say, 20 years than ever before. The main resources that will be left will be in the Middle East. I mean, people talk about the Caspian Sea and this and that, but those are not, they're not comparable, as far as anyone knows, to Middle East oil. Maybe there'll be some, incredible breakthrough, you can never guess, but it's not at all unlikely that the Middle East oil resources will be an extremely important lever of world control in the not too distant future, and that the whole system may be running down. And, the global industrial system depends on oil. Now, that could have awesome consequences. There isn't much thinking about it, as far as I know, maybe outside the oil companies. But people ought to be thinking about it.
Let's go over here to Tom's side. How you doing, Dr. Chomsky? In one of my graduate courses, I came across a book, Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, where his basic premise is that democratic liberalism and free market principles was the last philosophical and evolutionary apex of mankind. And my core emphasis is basically the free market, and the incompatibility is there, and the strong correlation between the state and investors. You hear a lot about Dick Armey, Trenton Lott, Newt Gingrich talk about, the promises of the free market. We know they're dependent on public subsidies via the taxpayers. And I wanted to know, why should we accept, when investments go wrong, the inconsistencies of the free market, that we have to pay for the bailout for not here at home, but else worldwide?
Yeah.
My perfect case study is the East Asian bank crisis.
Say Indonesia.
Right.
That's a fair question. The only, criticism I have to make about the way the question is formulated is it presupposes, or seems to presuppose, that there is something like a free market. And that's an illusion. Rich people would never permit a free market. Ideologists like Fukuyama can talk about it if they want, that's fine. But in the real world, it doesn't happen. If you look at their own examples, like Alan Greenspan's examples, the internet, computers, transistors, etc., you see case by case that it's a totally different story. But what about the bailouts? Let's take Indonesia. Now, there's a debate, which is an interesting case. Indonesia is so far not quite accepting the IMF terms. It's the current bailout figure is something like $30 or $40 billion. Well, everybody in the IMF knows exactly where they can get $30 or $40 billion without going into your pocket. Indonesia is a family-owned business. Ever since 1965, there was a military coup supported and backed by the United States. It led to the biggest massacre since the Holocaust. The U.S., about 500,000 to 1 million people were murdered in a couple of months, mostly landless peasants. It was greeted with unrestrained euphoria in the United States. They were so happy about it, they couldn't even keep quiet. This whole episode has disappeared from history because it's just too embarrassing. But if you look at the New York Times and so on, they were just totally gleeful as the blood was flowing. And You know, it was the Time magazine talked about the boiling bloodbath, and the New York Times about the staggering mass slaughter, and they were cheering it. You know, they were saying it's praising the American government for having kept its own role in the background so as not to embarrass the moderate Suharto and generals who were leading it. And it's an amazing episode. Actually, I reviewed it in print if you're interested. But ever since then, Suharto has been the darling of the West. I mean, he invaded East Timor, killed a couple 100,000 people. He tells us himself that in his autobiography that they let in the 1980s in Indonesia, he left, I forget how many he said, something like 10,000 corpses of Indonesians in Indonesia, just as leaving them scattered around to be warnings to others, and he's not particularly secret about it. Meanwhile, he and his family just took over the country. And it's a rich country, and there's plenty of resources. It was opened up to foreign investment, and the only impediment to it was the robbery of the Suharto family and their cronies. Well, you want to get $30 or $40 billion right in Indonesia, you know, easy enough. Just go to the family that owns the country. But of course, you don't do that sort of thing. Suharto, as the Clinton administration described him, he's our kind of guy. You know, that's the phrase. And he is, yeah, he's opened the place up to foreign robbery and so on. So you don't go into their pockets to pay it off. What you do is ask Western taxpayers to pay it off. And it's the same as the same with the other cases. It was the same with the Mexican bailout a couple of years earlier. These things are increasing. Each one is bigger than the last one. And that has to do with the increasing irrationality of financial markets. They're huge, they're totally irrational, they're governed by herd-like behavior, nobody knows what's going to happen. The IMF itself reports that it has about 180 members. It says that almost 3/4 of them have had serious banking and other financial crises since the liberalization of capital in 1980, and 1/4 of them have had very serious crises like these, and they're unpredictable, you know, increasing in scale to the extent that even really conservative figures, like say, you know, the chief economist of the World Bank, who I mentioned recently, had an article about it, or the Bank for International Settlements. That's the organization of central bankers, you know, real conservative, old-fashioned outfit, quite different from academic economists. They don't take the theology all that seriously. And they've been calling for, because they're much more concerned with, you know, what's going on in the real world. They, after all, have most of them, you know, they got most of it in their pocket. And they've been calling for some kind of regulation of financial markets for years to try to stop this. But why should we pay? Well, of course we shouldn't, you know. And remember, it's not just we that pay. I mean, the people who really pay are the people of those countries. I mean, we pay some, you know, but they pay with their lives and their blood. It was true in Mexico, it's true in East Asia, and so on. I mean, basically what the IMF is doing is trying to, the IMF is not an independent institution, it's mainly under U.S. control on other powerful countries to some extent. What it's doing is trying to integrate the East Asian countries and others into Western-dominated financial and other markets and place them under control. So, like, turn them into Latin America. I don't know if they can get away with it. Like, Korea's fairly substantial economy and pretty independent, but that's what they're trying to do.
Let's go back here.
I had a question regarding what we can do to control U.S. policy. As you mentioned, Indonesia is one example of the United States establishing basically dictatorships abroad, if not supporting bloody dictatorships. Indonesia, El Salvador, Argentina, you know, the list goes on and on. And of course, these governments are basically puppets for the United States government, which is a puppet for corporations, and they're not really working in the interest of the best interest of their people. And labor exploitation is going on like crazy. Like you have in Pakistan, children working for 60 cents a day for American corporations such as Nike, you know, making soccer balls to sell over here with no regulation going on in the country at all. So I was wondering, since a lot of these corporations that are responsible for human rights abuses are American-based, is there anything we can do to regulate them, or is it just hopeless?
Oh, there's a lot that can be done. In fact, Nike's a case in point. They've been forced to, just by public pressure here and public agitation, they've been compelled to, at least on paper, introduce conditions on labor rights. They're now incidentally being charged with failure to meet their own technical conditions, but some have done it. It's possible to agitate here to compel US-based corporations to improve labor rights abroad, just as it's possible to get them to allow union organizing here, but it takes pressure. On the other hand, bear in mind that this is, again, like asking the king to be more benevolent. You know, it's not a bad thing to do. You know, a benevolent king is better than a murderous king. But we should recognize that there's something wrong with asking the king to be more benevolent. And obvious what's wrong. Why should they have the right to make any such decisions at all, is the question we should be asking. But given current circumstances, yeah, there's a lot of things you can do to put pressure on the king or to become a more benevolent dictator. And it's being done. I mean, there are very good groups that are, in fact, there's a labor rights group here in the United States, grew out of the unions, which has done a lot of exposure of working conditions in the third world. They just published a report on working conditions in China. They actually hit the headlines once with a real coup in El Salvador. Actually even made 60 Minutes. The group pretended to be a group of business. They sent some delegates down there who were pretending to be U.S. businessmen who wanted to establish a business in El Salvador. So they went to the American Embassy, which is in charge of supporting, business investment, and they told them, yeah, we would like to establish a business. I don't know what they're going to do, make paper bags or something or other. And they wanted to know, what kind of support can you give us? And is this a good place to invest? And that sort of thing. And they were taken into the offices of the appropriate part of the embassy, where the embassy official explained to them that El Salvador was a great place to do business. For one thing, they didn't have to worry about unions, because they had a computerized system already in which any worker who was ever involved in union activities was listed and could be blackballed and keep him off and so on and so forth. And he went on, explaining why it's such a terrific place to do business. Well, unfortunately for him, they had a hidden microphone. So all this stuff was on tape, it was played. And it, certain degree of publicity did impose some conditions on U.S. investors. How much, I don't know. Same has been going on in Guatemala, shirt manufacturers and others, like in South Africa, it had some effect. The Sullivan law. These things have some effect, and they're certainly worth doing. But they're, they are not the core of the problem. They're always going to arise in some other form as long as you have unaccountable tyrannical systems that are making decisions.
Hey, Tom, back over here.
Yes. What role do religious institutions play? You speak a lot about multinational corporations and so forth and so on. I'd like to know through your research, what role do religious institutions play in the whole economic structure of the world?
Different roles. There's no single answer. Take, say, the Catholic Church. The Vatican is now greatly praised as, for its efforts, which were real, in helping bring democracy to Eastern Europe. So the Pope is the man of the century and all this kind of thing. Well, all that's true. The Vatican played a constructive role in Eastern Europe, where the church was being suppressed and so on. In the very same years, this tells you something about ourselves, in the 1980s, the church in Central America was suffering far worse oppression than in Eastern Europe. In Poland, for example, one priest was killed by the police. The killers were immediately apprehended, jailed, long sentences and so on. In El Salvador, the Archbishop was murdered, 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals were murdered, 4 American Catholic nuns and lay workers were murdered, hundreds of priests and nuns were, It was just a massacre. And that was a small part of the massacre. The real victims were peasants and union leaders and so on. What was the Vatican doing about that? Well, it's not a pretty story, in fact. That massacre, the killers of the Archbishop and the Jesuit intellectuals and so on, they were armed and trained and run by the United States. Okay, so therefore that's not an issue, you know. And in fact, ask yourself, well, do a poll among your friends and ask them how many people can mention the name of an Eastern European dissident, and how many can mention the name of the 6 Jesuit intellectuals who were murdered by U.S. trained forces leading dissidents in Central America. You'll get an interesting answer to that. Try to find their books in a library, you know, try to find articles about them. Try to find a discussion of the role that the Vatican played in not, you know, putting guns in people's hands, but in giving substantial support to the suppression of these groups. Now, what about the church? Well, you know, a lot of the popular movements in Central America, a big galvanizing element was, in fact, the church. You know, a good part of it came out of liberation theology. Latin American bishops in the 1960s shifted the traditional mission of the church, which had been service to the rich. That's its traditional role. And it was shifted in bishops' meetings to what was called the preferential option for the poor. So priests and nuns would go out and try to organize base communities of peasants where they'd read the Gospels and interpret them as modes of liberation and set up peasant associations and so on. The U.S. didn't waste much time. It reacted with mass murder. You know. The Reagan administration carried out major atrocities in Central America. A couple 100,000 people were slaughtered. You know. 3 countries were devastated. The church was one of the main victims. The fact that the decade began with the murder of an archbishop and ended with the murder of 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals, it's kind of symbolic, killed by essentially the same hands. So the church was on both sides. You know. You can't answer the question, what was the church? What's the role of the church? Well, different roles. The elements of the church in Central and all of Latin America played an extremely courageous and honorable role, and many of them paid for it with their lives, at our hands, I should say. But other parts of the church behaved differently, including, with regard to Latin America, the Vatican, which essentially undermined liberation theology, while indeed supporting freedom in Poland.
Let's go back here to Sally.
Do you see any parallels between NAFTA and other free trade agreements in Latin America, like CARICOM and Mercosur and others?
Well, Mercosur is a internal Latin. It's the southern cone. You know, southern countries of Latin America formed their own regional alliance. The United States is not very happy about that. I mean, any regional alliance is always undermines free trade. I mean, it's giving support to, you know, it has rules of origin and preferential treatment for insiders as distinct from outsiders and so on. And the United States would undoubtedly like to extend, you know, NAFTA-style agreements to undermine things like Mercosur, which is to some extent a competing alliance. You know, does not want to have an independent South America. The United States does not have a free hand in South America. I mean, Europe is interested, you know, Japan is interested, there's plenty of other investment, and there's a conflict as to, and they've got, you know, their own interests, so it's complex.
We have time for one more question, and let's go back here.
I've been interested by what you've been talking about not sort of appealing to kings to be more benign. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what are some concrete steps we could take to take the more systemic approach that you obviously favor, and certainly I would favor as well. What can we do to get at the core of it, given how much the people of this country have bought into so many of the models which at best say we should appeal to the benevolence of the rulers?
That's what organizing and activism is about, to try to get people to understand that their best interest does not lie in accepting theologies and doctrines and passivity and submission and subordination and so on. I mean, hierarchical, illegitimate societies have always existed, and they usually have public acquiescence. So like slaves weren't revolting all the time. I mean, there were slave revolts, but much of the time slaves accepted their condition, and tried to improve their lives within that condition. Okay, people who didn't accept that led slave revolts. And the same is true of every other form of oppression, from the worst, across the range. I mean, take a totally different issue. Take the subordination of women in patriarchal societies, like every society we know. Largely it persists because women accepted it. I mean, they may have accepted it out of fear, or maybe because they couldn't think of an alternative, but somehow or other they internalized it. They internalized the oppression. When they stopped internalizing it, you got a challenge to it. And that's exactly the role of people who want to think about illegitimate structures and get other people to think about it. It happens all the time. It's nothing, it's not like something kind of from outer space. We've all seen it happen in our own recent lifetimes in many areas. And there's no reason that I can see why we shouldn't have the insight into reality that say, like where I live in eastern Massachusetts, which is kind of like the center of early industrial revolution. You go back to the mid-19th century, there was a very lively independent press run by artisans from Boston, or what were called factory girls, young women from the farms who went to work in the mills in Lowell and so on. They were saying that they didn't see any justification for they had fought for freedom in the Civil War, they thought, and they didn't want to be subjected to slavery, wage slavery after the Civil War. Those who worked in the mills ought to own them. They shouldn't live in a feudalistic system in which others control and dominate them. Can't we, I mean, those were in the same genes as people today. They could understand what was going on around them, and they opposed it, I think rightly. Turns out they were ultimately suppressed by force. There was a lot of, as I mentioned, plenty of violence that suppressed the U.S. labor movement. But those are, I think, perfectly legitimate ideas which can be revived. I don't even regard them as particularly radical. They're kind of like commonsensical, which is why they keep cropping up all over the time, all the time. And it's exactly anyone who's interested in these issues has precisely the task that's more or less implicit in your question. Get people to think about them, to decide whether they want to accept the subordination, whether they want to believe the doctrines, or whether they want to challenge them. And if they do, there are lots of ways to do it. I mean, we have options open to us that people don't have in other countries. I mean, when the landless workers movement in Brazil, say, huge movement of people hundreds of thousands of people who are trying to get land, which is very highly concentrated, and they live in miserable conditions. When they try to take unused land, they're likely to get murdered. I mean, it happens all the time. We're not going to get murdered. We have a tremendous amount of privilege and freedom, which has been won. It wasn't granted, it was won. But it's there, and it gives you opportunities that very few people in the world have. So there's a lot that you can do.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky.